Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a really fascinating and deeply investigative look at a massive dossier by author and researcher Senad Dizdarević. We're going to explore a concept that honestly challenges the very foundation of how society raises its youth. Dizdarević makes the case that there is a huge structural blind spot in how we protect children. You see, we fiercely protect their physical bodies, right? But we leave this gaping vulnerability when it comes to their minds. He calls this the age of religious consent, and it's a framework that's absolutely going to make you look at the world a little differently. Think about this stark contradiction hiding right in plain sight. In almost every modern society, we require a person to reach cognitive maturity, which is usually around 18 years old, before they can vote, gamble, buy alcohol, or even get a tattoo. And why is that? Well, because we all acknowledge they need the brain power and life experience to understand choices that are irreversible or highly impactful. Yet, when it comes to religious identity assignment, literally the belief system that shapes a child's entire existential worldview, their morality, and their understanding of reality, there is zero minimum age. There's just no protection at all. So to really unpack this, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the legal blind spot, move into the psychology of religious conditioning, and then examine the invisible generational chain. After that, we'll look at contradictions in existing law, review the proposed Consentence Act, and wrap up with the final cognitive frontier.
Starting with Part 1, the legal blind spot, protecting bodies, ignoring minds.
Mainstream child protection is incredibly strict when it comes to guarding kids from physical harm, but it completely misses cognitive liberties. Listen to this historical quote from Jesuit instructions. "Give them to us as young as possible, and we will make of them anything we want." That chillingly frames Dizdarević's central premise. He argues that assigning a religion to a child before they can independently think for themselves isn't actually imparting authentic faith. In this framework, it's strictly classified as programming. The historical goal has literally been to install the belief before the capacity for doubt even exists.
Biologically speaking, it's kind of wild when you think about it. This programming relies on taking advantage of a child's developing hardware. Kids are routinely given life-altering answers about the cosmos and eternal consequences before their frontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic and critical reasoning, is even physically formed. They are handed the conclusions before they possess the physical brain hardware to even question the premise.
Moving on to Part 2, Psychology of Religious Conditioning, the emotional stakes.
So what happens when existential fear is used as an early educational tool? Well, the source introduces us to religious trauma syndrome, or RTS. This is a recognized clinical pattern documented by psychologist Dr. Marlene Winell, and it gives serious professional weight to the psychological harm of early indoctrination. We aren't just talking about a mild difference of opinion here. We're looking at documented symptoms that actually mirror complex PTSD caused by high-control environments where chronic anxiety and identity suppression become totally normalized.
Let's walk through exactly how this trauma is built. You've got the fear of hell and eternal punishment, the sheer terror of divine surveillance over your private thoughts, and the fear of social exclusion from your own family just for doubting. Developmental psychology actually identifies these specific mechanisms as adverse childhood experiences. Using the threat of hell against a child creates this chronic dissociation and shame, and it breeds a type of obedience that actively suppresses independent reasoning.
Which brings us to Section 3. The invisible generational chain, how it reproduces. If this system causes so much harm, why on earth does it keep going? Well, it survives not through malice, but through a tragic, self-replicating loop of inherited conditioning. Generation 1 is indoctrinated in childhood. Because it's all they know, when they raise Generation 2, they pass down the exact same conditioning, genuinely believing they are providing love and spiritual safety. The author makes a really poignant observation here. Parents are not the bad guys. They're desperately trying to protect their kids using unhealed, inherited programming. The generational chain is totally invisible because it's disguised as love.
And the scale of this invisible chain is just staggering. 85%. That is the portion of the global population that identifies as religious today. And the research shows that the vast majority of these billions of people were involuntarily assigned this identity before the age of 5. Way before they could ever actually consent. There's this really evocative quote from Robert M. Pirsig used in the dossier that hits the nail on the head regarding cultural normalization. Because this deeply ingrained childhood programming happens to 85% of the globe, it's just completely normalized. I mean, think about it. If any other institution used threats of eternal torture to enforce compliance in toddlers, it would trigger an immediate child protection intervention, right? But because it's culturally categorized as religion, it's legally protected.
All right, part 4, contradictions in existing law, the UN and evangelical precedents. Let's look at how international law actually contains these massive contradictions. Under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 14 explicitly protects a child's freedom of thought and religion. The child actually possesses this right, not just the parents. But that creates a massive unresolved contradiction. How can a child have the right to freedom of thought if a permanent religious identity is legally allowed to be assigned to them before they can even speak? The author highlights another fascinating precedent by posing this striking question. Recently, major conservative and evangelical institutions have successfully argued that minors lack the cognitive maturity and life experience to undergo irreversible gender transitions. Dizdarević neutrally points out that this is the exact same logical framework that applies to early religious enrollment. If the cognitive maturity argument restricts irreversible medical transitions, the author argues it must logically restrict irreversible religious transitions assigned to minors too. To further challenge assigning these beliefs to children, the source outlines what's called the 4 evidence cluster. Basically, this asserts that teaching kids God claims is actually teaching physically impossible concepts as pure facts. For example, arguing that a creator made something from nothing directly violates the first law of thermodynamics. The main takeaway here is that children are being taught factual inaccuracies as absolute, unassailable truths long before they can analyze the physics or the logic behind them. Let's jump to Section 5. The Proposed Consent Act, a legislative solution. So what's the actual legislative fix to close this loophole? The proposal is called the Age of Religious Consent Act, or ARCA. The mechanism is super simple. It sets the minimum age to 18 for formal religious enrollment, binding rituals like baptism, and compulsory religious instruction. It acts strictly as a primary prevention measure. Now, it's absolutely vital to note that ARCA doesn't ban religion. It simply protects the developing mind, holding off formal assignment until a person reaches the cognitive maturity to give actual informed consent. It's super crucial to clarify a major distinction here. ARCA does not ban teaching children about religion. Academic, evidence-based religious education, where multiple perspectives are presented and questioning is encouraged, is entirely permitted. What ARCA outlaws is unilateral indoctrination, presenting one single perspective as absolute truth, punishing a kid for doubting, and demanding fear-based compliance. And look at how this fits perfectly into the historical evolution of child rights. In the early 20th century, we finally restricted child labor. Later, we regulated corporal punishment. In the 21st century, we expanded frameworks against institutional abuse. Historically, child protection law constantly evolves to limit unchallenged adult authority. The dossier argues that establishing cognitive freedom and religious consent is simply the inevitable, logical next step. Finally, Section 6, the final cognitive frontier. What would society actually look like if this blind spot were corrected? According to the author, a post-ARCA society would be incredibly transformative. If religion becomes a purely adult choice, those communities would naturally be smaller, sure, but they'd be vastly more intellectually serious and committed. Faith would become an authentic, mature adult choice, totally free from that invisible chain of childhood fear conditioning. The author even provides deconstruction tools, like his IPO method, to help adults safely transition out of inherited beliefs. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought from the source material. Just consider this for a second. Is it true freedom of religion if the choice was permanently made for you before you even knew how to think? It's a question that really challenges our deepest assumptions, asking us to reconsider what true cognitive freedom actually means for the next generation. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.